I have 20 minutes, so I'll complete the rest of my personal introduction by telling you that I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I've been involved with psychedelics / entheogens for many years in one way or another. And about 5 years ago, as part of this conference that Tom just mentioned, I was having a conversation with Kathleen Harrison, who some of you may know as the former wife of Terence McKenna, one of the great spokespeople for the psychedelics, until he died in 2002 or so, 2000 maybe. Anyway, I told Kathleen that I thought cannabis was getting short shrift as a spiritual medicine. That's the purpose of this conference, is to share information, educate people on the sort of wise, effective, responsible, environmentally and culturally sustainable use of these medicines like psilocybin and ayahuasca and peyote and others. And so I mentioned to Kathleen, oh yes, if more people would come and join me, I'd be happy about that. And because I can't move because Jeremy's got me on film here, so it'd be nice to be more intimate with you guys. But anyway, whatever you're comfortable with.
How intimate would you like us to be?
Oh, there you go. Jeez, on our first date even.
Buy me a drink later.
Yeah. So I was having a conversation with Kathleen Harrison, and I said something about that to her, that cannabis wasn't getting the attention it deserves and needs as a spiritual medicine. And she said, well, I think that'd be a really important book, and if you put it together, I'll contribute to it. Well, I know some of her writing. She's never written a book, but she's written several essays in other people's books and so on, and she's a beautiful writer. She's a really insightful person, deep wisdom person, and so that was kind of the trigger to go ahead with that project. So that was 5 years ago. I collected a total of 18 contributors to the book, including myself. I've contributed a couple of chapters here and there. I got really lucky with one of my favorite publishers, Inner Traditions, Park Street Press, Bear and Company, and came out in December. And so the purpose of the book, it may stand to reason, I guess, is to redress this issue. Because for starters, I like to point out, as does one of the contributors to the book, that cannabis truly does have an ancient and widespread history of spiritual use on this planet. Some of you may be aware of that, maybe not. For starters, the lineage, the plant lineage that cannabis is part of or comes from, the Cannabaceae, I don't know if you know how to pronounce that word, I always pronounce it Cannabaceae, lineage is estimated to be between 30 and 90 million years old on this planet. So it's an old lineage and plant. It's fairly obvious that cannabis has been deeply intertwined with human affairs as long as anyone could even imagine, let alone, the actual evidence that we have. We know it goes back probably about 10,000 years or so in Chinese culture. In fact, researchers think that it might even have originated in northeastern China. We know, for example, that there are findings from the grave sites of shamans from the Neolithic era, which is about 7,500 years ago, with cannabis residue. So it was clear that it's been used shamanically for a very long time, and it just stands to reason that it would have been even far longer before the, quote, dawn of civilization, because it was everywhere. It grows easily, as you know, and people were using it for everything. They were using it for, building materials, clothing, rope, netting, all kinds of medicines, etc., etc. Oil, for cooking, for cosmetics, for painting, whatever, So, it seems rather obvious that people would find out that you could get high from it too. And if you found that out, then at least some of the people would find out that if you sort of, as Terence McKenna used to like to say, sit down, shut up, and pay attention, then you might find, which is again where the book comes in, that there are some deep spiritual awakenings that can happen with the use of cannabis. So the purpose of the book, again, was to acknowledge that, for starters, that this is what one of the contributors to the book called the people's psychedelic. I started using the term the people's plant. It's a little less dramatic than calling it the people's psychedelic, although I do think that it belongs in the pantheon of entheogenic substances, especially when it's used carefully, and sometimes, might require larger doses sometimes, but when it's used very, very skillfully. And on that point, I'd like to say that when it is really understood well, and I'm going to stop there. Hold that thought for a second. I just want to make a little disclaimer for a moment. I don't know what this audience is. I mean, I don't know what your experience is, and obviously we don't have time to find out. So, maybe any one of you, maybe a bunch of you have had quite a lot of experience with cannabis in some sort of, quote, spiritual way. So I just want to say, I hope I'm not talking obvious or down to anybody in any way. I'm just telling you what I think I understand and have learned and so on. So
you're so Canadian.
I haven't apologized as many times as you have yet. Well, I wish there was more time, because then I could tell you some, Canadian jokes. Like the New Yorker likes to make fun of Canadians occasionally. They have those one-panel cartoons, and one of my favorites is the caption is the Canadian Mafia, and it's a guy tied to a chair, and two guys standing over him in black suits with slick back hair and ties and everything, and they're both looking really tough, but the one guy says to the guy in the chair, he says, listen, you better start talking or Vinny here is going to say please. Canadian Mafia. Anyway, that's enough backtalk out of you, buddy. Excuse me, back to the story, as it were. It has this ancient, widespread lineage of spiritual use. It has the potential not only to assist in our spiritual awakening, but to actually have a significant, powerful effect in our spiritual awakening. I truly believe that. And I don't just believe it, because on one level I think that belief plus $2 will get you a cup of coffee. It has to come from experience. And although I don't make dramatic claims about my own personal experience, I've certainly had glimpses of what I would consider to be deep presence with cannabis, and I compare that in a sense to other experiences I've had with the so-called major entheogens. So I know that cannabis can do that too. Like many of us, I've had moments of feeling a distinct sense of connecting to something that's much bigger, or when you might say even unconditionally true. And I've had moments of settling into what you might call the peace that passes all understanding, if you know that old phrase attributed to Jesus. I think they said passeth, but that's okay. That was the King James version, I guess. Excuse me. I'm going to jump ahead quickly because we're really short on time here. I usually make this talk about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we open it up for questions. So there's a physiological, or what you might call a biochemical rationale for how this works, or explanation, when I'll just give you the really, really condensed version tonight. Joan Bello is one of the contributors to the book. She talks about how when you smoke cannabis or vaporize it, oral ingestion being different, of course, because it can take up to 2 hours to reach full effect. But if you smoke it or vaporize it, as you know, I'm sure, the effects are pretty much immediate. And one of the things that I don't know if you've noticed or not, I didn't really pay much attention to it until Joan pointed it out, is there's an increase in your heart rate at the beginning. And what that's doing is pumping an increased supply of rich, freshly oxygenated blood into the whole organism. And as part of that, and this is, like I say, the classic comic book version here, basically, there's an expansion of the musculature, which he calls the oppositional muscles, allowing breath to go more deeply into the lungs, which again pumps more blood into the system, so that the whole system becomes what, again, Joan Bello calls the condition is considered or described as a charged equilibrium. A number of the researchers that talk about cannabis, such as Dr. Robert Melamede, use also the term creating a condition of homeostatic balance. I'm going to have to cut that one short. It's a very bare bones description of that effect. So, but if we can go from there, the next question, in my mind at least, is, okay, so then what do you do with that? The simplest way of condensing that down into a phrase or a couple of words is that cannabis amplifies. Okay, that's the sort of the most layperson way you can talk about it. It amplifies. So then, what do you do with that? You can say it amplifies or it energizes. And that's where, if you're talking about cannabis as a spiritual medicine or a spiritual ally, intention, right? Having an intention, having some discipline, having some focus for what you want the plant to do. One of the contributors to the book, Steve Dyer, says it's really important to him to know what he wants to use the plant for, because it will energize whatever your intention is. And if I had longer, what I would say about that too is that that can also be why cannabis is harmful for some people, and I'm sure you know that too. People become heavily dependent upon it. I'm hesitant to use the word addicted because it's physiologically barely addictive, I think, but it can be intensely psychologically addictive or dependency-inducing. So if your intention is unconscious, or if it's to escape, avoid feeling, avoid connection, Kathleen Harrison in her chapter talks about how she has seen a lot of people tending to be younger people, tending to be male, who get so cozy with the cannabis space they get into, they want to do it all the time and they don't want to come out of it into what she calls the daylight world of relationship and responsibility. So if your intention at whatever level of consciousness or unconsciousness is to escape, avoid, not take responsibility for yourself, etc., 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 cannabis can go there too, because it's in that sense neutral. It's a very gracious plant, you know. But if your intention is to be present, to wake up, to heal, so to speak, the amplification process or capability of the plant can deepen or strengthen that intention as well. I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, if not all of you, understand that principle. So, again, this is the condensed talk, so I'm going to move right on to, if that's true, that it has this sort of physiological function, and then intention allows you to direct that amplification, that amplified energy, then what do you do with that? Well, in the book, I and some of the other contributors talk about how you can make use of cannabis in all your spiritual practices. I don't know if all of them is quite accurate, but the way I like to talk about it is that you could apply the use of cannabis in conjunction with meditation and a number of other spiritual practices that range from essentially formless meditation or presence to increasing degrees of form or activity or action in your practice. So simply just sitting and being present, the aforementioned sit down, shut up, and pay attention admonition is about as formless as you can get. Ganesh Baba, a crazy wisdom Indian guru, once said he had two rules for smoking cannabis. One is sit up straight with your spine aligned so that the energy can move. And secondly, dedicate your smoking to Shiva. That was his deity. So, but for us, it could be anything. But that may be a little too loose, so to speak, for a lot of people, because cannabis as an amplifier can also amplify speed. It can also amplify thought processes, most of us probably know as well, right? You know, get into the busy mind thing, or you think you're having the best creative thought ever, and you actually might be, but then it's also the tricky part about the thought stuff is that you know, I like to refer to Buddhist teachings. I was involved with Tibetan Buddhism for a long time. The way Buddhist teachings talk about the thinking process is that it's our primary strategy for avoiding reality, for avoiding the non-existence of the illusionary self, the ego, you know, that sees itself as separate from everything and just, you know, figures like you have to struggle your way through the world and protect yourself all the time and so on and so on. This is the ink cloud that we use to obscure that reality, is our thinking, you know, the overlapping thoughts that create this kind of layers of curtains between us and emptiness is the Buddhist term for it. They say that you have to go into emptiness before you could, you know, come out into awakening. There's a phrase that I often like to quote from Buddhism, which is emptiness becomes luminosity. But first of all, we have to allow ourselves to empty of the old story, or the old stories that we, you know, have put that by which we put together our whole life, and that tell us what's right and what's wrong, and what's true and what's not true, and real and unreal, and all that stuff, and what we're capable of and what we're not capable of. Those are all the stories that live in our heads that we pick up from the time we're born, and some would say from previous lives even. I don't normally talk this fast, by the way, but I'm trying to. I'm greedy. I'm greedy. I want to get as much as possible in 20 minutes before Tom gets the cane that he's got hiding behind the thing there. Ideally, it would be great if one's intention is to wake up with the assistance of cannabis, or you might even say the cannabis spirit, to at least some of the time you're working with it, try to allow it to be itself without doing anything particularly. In other words, not putting on music or reading or chatting with friends or whatever, just being there with it. There's a phrase in the Native American church which is watch out for head traffic, because you have to surrender to those medicines. And people are casual about cannabis because it's so common and it seems to be more gentle and all that. But when you really relate to it in the ways that I'm talking about, it can be what a number of researchers and experienced practitioners call a very advanced spiritual medicine, because indeed, in the ideal circumstances, or the optimal, I suppose you could say, circumstances, it can actually allow us to open up completely to presence. And in fact, how to put this in a short amount of time, because I usually just get to ramble about it for a while. Okay, so maybe I'll just tell you this. This is, again, the condensed version. You could think of the spiritual awakening journey from, say, beginning to end as one that, say, starts over here where you're living your whole life through the second-hand information of the stories, right? The narratives that you've developed that tell you who you are and what everything else is. The journey of awakening from there is generally, almost always gradually, I think, learning to trust unconditional intelligence of right now without concept. Buddhists talk a lot about concept, layers and layers of concept that we build up, right? And it's in emptying all that stuff and allowing ourselves to be fully present that we wake up, and then we learn to trust that. Ideally, that's the path, is that we learn to gradually trust that. So you could think of cannabis as an energy medicine, that it allows you to deepen your entrance into the present moment. And then the more you do that, Joan Bello in the book talks about it like that too, that in some sense the high is almost a side effect. It can be extremely lovely, as most people who have experienced it know, right? But it's also going to wear off in a couple of hours, and you're probably going to be back at more or less at base camp again, right? And where you started from. So the question is people like the great religious scholar Houston Smith would say something like, we're trying to move from altered states to altered traits. In other words, a spiritual life, not just spiritual experiences. Mm-hmm. So, he had another one that I just came upon a couple of days ago, which was something like from passing illuminations to abiding light, which I thought was really good as well. So it's really a life journey. And what cannabis can do in that regard is it can be a retraining process of trusting the moment. I think, as I say, it's really important for at least part of the time that one is doing one's practice with cannabis for that intention, to try to be empty with it. Try to just be still. Try to allow the thoughts to die away. Fall away, not with any kind of judgment, just like what it is, you want to kill your boss, fine, it's just a thought, come back to, and then you're allowing, the way I like to think of cannabis in that regard is you're allowing the plant to do its work unobstructed. This is where the avoid the head traffic thing comes in, right? If we can get out of our obscuring thinking mind. I always like what Eckhart Tolle said about that too, the Power of Now guy. He said, the ideal relationship with your thinking mind would be if you could treat it as a tool that you pick up when you need to use it, but when you don't need to use it, you can put it down. Unlike the way Buddhist teachings talk about the thinking mind as something that controls us in a sense, because we're using it to obscure reality. So, the real short version is that you could do yoga with, cannabis with yoga and a whole bunch of other practices, chanting, sacred drumming, shamanic drumming, whatever. It can also support other entheogens or psychedelics, and if I had more time I'd go into that too, and it's discussed by two of the contributors to the book who have used cannabis successfully in conjunction with ayahuasca ceremonies because it has the potential to do several things. It can potentiate the effects of another medicine, it can soothe them or smooth them, it can clarify insights. They sometimes use it at the end of ayahuasca ceremonies for the sharing sessions, because if you do cannabis in a sort of a clear, silent way, if you do cannabis in a kind of a clear, silent way, when you've already had these powerful medicines, going on for a few hours, it can really help clarify your insights. And that's the way some of these ayahuasca people use it. Just that cannabis can be a supporter, and I like to think of it as a humble plant that way. If you, I don't know, you maybe have had this kind of experience. If you take some, say, psilocybin mushrooms, and 2 hours later, you have, at least this is my experience and other people I've talked to, say 2 hours later, you have a couple of tokes. It's not going to feel like a cannabis high. It's going to feel like a mushroom high with this sort of little extra jolt or whatever, or even that smoothness thing that I was talking about, right? So I think of it as a kind of like a bodhisattva. I've never used that term before to describe cannabis, but she serves us. I see her as a healer. I see her as a kind of a saint in a sense, that if we can treat her with respect, if we can treat her as a holy medicine, as a sacred medicine, and give ourselves to her completely when we're with her. I'm not saying all the time, and I do want to say also that please don't take anything I'm saying as judgment against you if you're using cannabis daily. That's up to you, of course. That's the people's plan, like I said, right? We should always be free to use cannabis the way we want. I would just personally hope that if I knew you and you were a friend of mine, you were using it beneficially in your life. And the more attention we give it, the more respect, the more calmness, the more we pay attention to the setting, internal and external, the chances are we're going to learn more from it. The more we can get out of our own way, so to speak, and just be there with her like she's a lover, like she's our teacher, like she's our therapist in that moment, And then she can teach us how to let go into the moment more deeply. And, as you've probably discovered, since you're probably all cannabis people, she can also be a truth serum. One of the contributors to the book, Jeremy Wolff, says, pot leaves you naked, and the first thing you see is yourself. So people that don't like pot probably have that experience and go, oh, fuck, I don't want to. I'm going back to my dominator mode, it can humble us in allowing ourselves to see more clearly where we do make missteps, where we are perhaps in need of some corrective action in our way that we conduct ourselves, so that she can tenderize us that way, she can sensitize us that way. I could say a lot more, but I've probably talked more than 20 minutes already.
We open it up to discussion, so there's still plenty more conversation.
Oh, okay, good point. Yeah, good point. Let me just say this then to sort of sum up the quote talk part of it. Two of the contributors to the book, and I kind of agree as a possibility, certainly not to make any kind of grand statement about it, that cannabis could be the sacrament of the universal religion of the future. One of the contributors to the book, Stephen Hager, who was editor-in-chief of High Times magazine for 25 years, calls it the sacrament of peace. That if you use it wisely in your life, and you don't have an unhealthy or overly dependent relationship on the plant, it can allow us to, in a sense, soften up the walls and the boundaries that we put around ourselves, connect with each other, connect with nature, connect with the spirit, connect with ourselves in that way. So I just wanted to end my portion of the sort of monologue by suggesting that in a completely non-dogmatic, non-hierarchical way that might only have, two two teachings in the whole book, like Ganesh Baba, sit down, shut up, and pay attention, McKenna thing, or sit with a straight spine and dedicate it to the spirit, and then just try to be mindful and respectful. This plant has the potential, if enough people use it that way, to make a big difference, I think, in the way that the affairs of humanity are conducted. So thank you.